In this video we're going to talk about setting properties in code. Now up to now we've used the property window in order to set properties. So for example, whenever we drag and drop a text box onto our form designer, we could set the text property from its default text box 1 to something like Bob. And notice that by default now we see Bob in the little window there. Let's also drag over a button control so that we can demonstrate some other things about setting the properties. Now whenever I make changes on the form designer like I'm doing here, I'm moving things around, I might be resizing things, I changed from text box 1 to Bob. This is called making changes in design time. And design time is a period of time when you're designing an application using the property window and the form designer like we're doing just now. Now, Visual Studio is pretty powerful. It can allow us to do a lot just at design time, just with the form designer and the property window. But I'm going to show you how to make your applications more powerful and how to actually use code to change properties in what's called runtime. And runtime is different than design time in so much that it's a period of time when you execute your application and the properties are set using code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the text property of our text box from Bob to Steve whenever somebody clicks our little button 1 down here at the bottom. So let's go ahead and double click button 1 because that is the event that we want to handle. When somebody clicks our button, we'll change the contents of our text box. So double clicking my button gives me my event method stub for button 1 underscore click. Let me do this. I'm going to delete this, and if you recall from the previous video, I'm going to delete out where it created that event handler for me as well. And I'm going to go back to my form designer, and I'm going to change the name of my object here, of my text box. So I'm going to change this to txt name, and I'm going to change my button to btn OK. And I'm going to change the text of my button as well to OK. And instead of double clicking my button, I'm going to go over here and select the events from the properties window and select the click event, and I'm just going to double click it there. And so that will do the same thing for me. Now I have private void btn OK, the new name of my control, underscore click. So now what if I forget the name of one of the, for example, the text box that I want to use? All I needed to do is go back to the designer and select that, and then look here in the properties window, txt name. So let's go back here, and I'm going to type in txt name. I got to keep the capitalization correct, and then I'm going to use the period or the dot on my keyboard. And when I do, notice that this little window pops up. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but for right now, let's just ignore that. And I'm going to type in the word text because that's the property that I want to set, the text property. And I'm going to change that from Bob to Steve. And I don't want to forget at the end of my lines, what character do I need? I need a semicolon. Okay. So let's go ahead and save this and run our application now. Whenever I click on the button, it should change the word Bob in my text box to Steve, and it does. Very cool. Now additionally, we can retrieve the property's value in code. So here we've set the property, we've set the text property of the name object to the word Steve, but we can also retrieve the property. So what we'll do is, before that we make the change, we'll display the old value. So let's do this. Message box dot show, and then we'll put in the name of our object, txt name dot text. So before we actually change the property, we're going to display the old property. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's click start. Okay, so it all worked. Excellent. So that's the difference between getting a property and setting a property. Here we are getting the property, so we're going to display it, and here we're setting it whenever we use the equal sign, and we're changing the value, or changing the value of the property of the txt name.text object and property. Okay, now remember just a moment ago whenever I said let's ignore the little box that pops up. Let's actually take a moment to look at it. Let's type in txt name, and I'm going to click the period or the dot on my keyboard, and notice that this little window pops up. This is called IntelliSense, and what it does, it gives us all of the properties and methods and even the events for this given object. Every property and method, we'll talk about methods later, and events that are supported by this object are available here. First of all, notice that there's this little finger pointing to a box. Those are properties. Okay, and the little lightning bolt, we already know what that means, right? Those are events. And then let's see if we can find a method. Here we go. There's a little brick that's kind of on the move. Suspended layout. This little icon means that this property, or I'm sorry, this value is actually a method. But we're going to ignore those for for the moment. So what I can do is I can either use the arrows on my keyboard, the up arrow and the down arrow, or I can use my mouse to scroll through here and see every single property, method, and event that are supported by this object. So, for example, if I wanted to change, let's say, the back color, let's scroll up to the top of the list since they're in alphabetical order, and I can just click even here in this area in order to get up quicker to the top. And I can drag this little bar here if I want to as well, just like any Windows application. And we're looking for back color. I can just double click it, and now it automatically types that in for me, so I don't have to memorize that. And here I want to set the back color to color.beige. How did I know the color object? Well, it's just from my familiarity with the .NET framework and the objects, and you don't need to know that right now. We'll talk about those a little bit later on, or in another video on LearnVisualStudio.net. But I need to type in the little line ending character, our semicolon, and then let's go to the next line. And let's change another property. Let's, for example, go change the left property so that whenever we click this button, it'll actually move our text box from one side of the screen to another side of our little form. So let's do txt name dot left equals, and we'll put 100. So 100 pixels will be the left starting point for our text box. So you can see with the vast number of methods and properties and events that there's a lot of ways to manipulate the objects within our application. And what makes our applications more interesting is when we change those at runtime whenever our application is executing, as opposed to just keeping them basically static at design time. Let's run our application now and see all the things that it does whenever we run it. First of all, when we click OK, notice that we get our little message box, and then it changed not only the value from Bob to Steve, it also moved it over to the left, so we're 100 pixels from the left-hand side of our Windows form. It also changed the background to a beige color. Okay, so it did quite a few things there. And there's other things that you'll want to be aware of in order to complete the exercise, which I highly recommend that you do. And that is, you need to change the top property, and that adjusts how far from the top of the form that the text box will appear, or any given control. And then also the width, so you can make it a smaller width and a larger width. And then also you can make the height property different as well, but we're not going to talk about that just now. So there's a lot of ways that you can modify the text box or any given control that you have on your Windows forms. Now before we conclude, I want to do one other thing. I want to show you what happens if we were to change the name of our control. So remember how we changed this from textbox1 to txt name? Let's change it again. Let's go back over to our property view. We were in our events view, but now we want to look at properties, so we're going to click this button over to the left of it, and now we can see the properties again. And here what we're going to do is change the name from txt name to like txt first name. Now what do you think is going to happen if we do this? Nothing? Or will something adversely affect our application? Well, if you said something will adversely affect our application, you'd be correct. Now, unlike Visual Basic, C# does not give you that automatic feedback that there's some problem. So you may not see anything visually here that points to problems. You may have to run your application first. And notice when we do that, we get a message that there were build errors. Should we continue? And I'm going to click no here. And then it shows us a task list with all the problems of our application. It basically gives us 4 messages that are exactly the same, although the lines are different, and that the txt name object or namespace could not be found. So I'm going to double click on one of these lines, and then notice that it highlights for me the problem, and now we get this blue squiggly line, which means that it cannot find any object in our application named txt name. That's because we changed it to txt first name. So let's go ahead and change all of these to txt first name. And when I change it, notice that the blue squiggly stays there. That's okay. But now that we've made those changes, let's save and run our application again. And this time it should compile. And it seems like we're just fine. We're able to run our application again. So Visual Studio does not make the correction automatically for you whenever you change the name of an object in the Properties window. You need to go back manually and change the name yourself if you ever have the urge to change the name of an object. So I again strongly encourage you to do the exercise for this lesson, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.